We heard from Whitney Wild moments ago about a new warning from the Department of Homeland Security about potential threats to the public and members of the Supreme Court following the leak of a draft opinion that looks to overturn Roe v. Wade. U.S. Marshals will provide around-the-clock security at the homes of all 9 Supreme Court justices. Joining me now is Independent Senator Angus King of Maine. He serves on the Senate Intelligence and Armed Services Committee. And Senator King, this Homeland Security bulletin here, or memo, I should say, is pretty concerning. It says across a broad range of ideologies, people across a broad range of ideologies are attempting to justify and inspire attacks against abortion-related targets and ideological opponents at lawful protests. Is this something that you've been briefed on, Senator?
We haven't been briefed on it yet. I think we have a briefing either today or early next week, but I've been following the issue. It's deeply concerning, John. We're getting to a place where we're sort of normalizing violence as a solution to political problems, and that's just a tragic development. But I think there's an important point underneath this, and that is that people who are in positions like myself, who have an opportunity to talk to the public, whether it's on television or through a blog or something online, a Facebook post, really have to think twice about what we're unleashing. Often people say things and they think, well, we're being passionate and leading our followers, but they're liable to strike a chord with somebody that, like this young man in New York, that it may not be so rational and may not be prepared to have the normal constraints. So words count, language counts, and I've observed over time that people that have an opportunity to lead have a real responsibility to be measured. Not that you give up your First Amendment rights, but you do have to be thoughtful, and that's what worries me. It's a two-pronged problem. It's people prone to violence and then people stoking it.
So, Senator, a NATO official has told CNN that the momentum in Ukraine seems to be shifting toward the Ukrainians, which I'm sure delights you. What upsets you, though, is that, in a way, U.S. intelligence didn't see this coming, or at least 10 weeks ago, before this all started, there was a lack of intelligence about, in a way, how good the Ukrainians were or their will to fight. Why is this of such concern to you?
Well, first I want to say that the U.S. intelligence community, the world intelligence community, did a sensational job before the invasion of warning people where the Russians were, what their intentions were, where they were posted along the Ukrainian border. And I think the Biden administration made a brilliant decision to release that information, which is somewhat unusual. Usually intelligence is held close. And releasing that information allowed the NATO and the world to rally at the time of the invasion. My concern is, and it goes back to Afghanistan as well, we didn't do as good a job of assessing what would happen after the invasion, that you use the term will to fight. Same thing in Afghanistan, and I do serve on the Intelligence Committee. I hear all these reports all the time, plus what we get in the public press. And in Afghanistan, the prediction was the Afghan government would last months or years after we left. That turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The government collapsed actually 2 weeks before we left. In Ukraine, it was the opposite. We overestimated the Russians and underestimated the Ukrainians. In the public press, you saw reports. We all saw them in February. If the Russians invade, they'll be in Kyiv in 3 days, and the country will fall in 2 weeks. That turns out to be terribly wrong. Had we had a better estimate of that information, we could have pre-positioned materials on the border. We could have had aid to the Ukrainians much quicker in the early days of the conflict. I'm not blaming anybody here. I'm just saying this is something we need to do better. It's hard. It's much harder to assess will to fight or the leadership of Zelensky versus the non-leadership of Ghani. But it's important, and I think there are ways that we can work at that. And I know that the intelligence community now is doing some soul searching about how do we assess this and make better decisions based upon better information.
Senator, before we started speaking, you heard the report from Melanie Zanona on Capitol Hill that had to do with Doug Mastriano getting the Republican nomination for governor in Pennsylvania. This is someone who, to this day, holds on to the big lie, the idea that the election in Pennsylvania was rigged or false and he wanted to throw out the election results. Well, if he wins, he'll be governor of Pennsylvania, and he would have the power to basically decide if the election gets certified in Pennsylvania next time around. How much of a concern is that these election deniers might be coming into positions of power over the next year?
It's a serious concern, and you put your finger on it. I'm not so concerned about somebody that thinks the election was stolen. I mean, they're going to think what they think, regardless of the facts. But the problem is, if he gets himself in a position where he can actually put his finger on the scale of the results, refuse to certify the election, for example, or just ignore the results of the vote, no matter what it is. And that's really dangerous. And this is happening all over the country. This is the most high-profile case. But there are people running for Secretary of State in various states who have control over the election machinery. And it's really a problem. It's one of the reasons we have to fix and shore up something called the Electoral Count Act, which goes back to the 1870s, that defines how this process is supposed to work so that a rogue governor or a rogue legislature can't overcome the will of the people, and that there's some recourse to the courts if that is attempted. But you asked the right question, and that is not so much what he thinks happened in 2020, it's what he might do in 2024 that I think should be of concern to all of us, including the people of Pennsylvania.
Senator Angus King, always a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, John. Great to see you.